Okay, so 15 death metal albums that you might have missed in 2022. And again, these are just picked not necessarily randomly, but they're picked for general quality, uh, tangential importance, or just variety is a big one. Overlooked things, essentially. And so again, I'm going to start one of these with a release that is from 2021, and it was a digital and cassette only release, uh, limited to 50 tapes. Similar to, if you'll remember how much I really loved that Desolate Realm record back in 2018. This has at least one of the same guys in it. So it was a similarly cult release, limited on purpose, and now they've gone as far as to reissue it on cassette through Caligari Records, and I believe on vinyl through Sentient Ruin. I could be wrong. That's what I remember about it. Impugner is a Norwegian death metal band, an old school death metal band, very much in the along the lines of Axo, the Unspeakable era, Autopsy. If you're not familiar with like what Autopsy sounded like in 1992, you're missing out on probably one of their best records, one of the most um, underrated records. If you like bands like Depigus and where the vocalist is a little bit wacky and the riffs are a little bit different and they've balanced in a bit of doom with bit of more punk, and it's all around kind of Autopsy's best hour for a lot of people. And Impugner really embody that a lot here in their own way. Now, granted, this style is sort of what a lot of people associate with early execration and obliteration out of Norway. I think that's a little bit off, but it's mostly kind of the idea here is these guys were all around during that, let's say, late 2000s era of Norwegian death metal, kind of becoming a crazy and a more interesting thing. Honestly, the old school stuff was picking up around that time, and bands like what is it? I think Discord, Desolation Realm, Death Hammer, and I think is it Lobotomized? Yeah, I think Lobotomized members are all part of this band, and they've done a great job with this first demo. They're kind of selling it as an album, a mini LP, however you want to call it. It's about 23 minutes worth of music, and all of it is great. And there's an autopsy cover in the middle of the thing, and it fits in perfectly. They've done such a good job with this. I couldn't put it down because I love this style, and it's a very easy thing to recommend up front. It kind of gets the juices flowing, as it were, because not all of these are going to be great, but this one up front is. Maybe it's a little bit old, but you probably haven't heard it yet. Deviants is a duo out of Chile, I think. It's still the Santiago area, as far as I know. I think one of them is from Pinaflor, however you would pronounce that. And basically, the style they're going for here is early death thrash metal, and the stuff that I like. Maybe I shouldn't say early. I should say late '80s, early '90s influenced form. Death thrash metal. Um, Now, I like normally when I compare something to Merciless, I'm thinking of the first demo and the first album. In this case, I'm thinking of the second album, The Treasures Within. It's a little bit more chaotic. It's a little bit more like brutal thrash in its attack, and otherwise, this band has a lot of like scream, bloody gore era death metal, death in its sound, and that's not in the typical way, not pushing into leprosy at all. Different drum style, different approach in general. And I thought it's a great EP. It's pretty short, but as you can see, they put um, as much effort and care into these works as they have in their other more like classic or extreme thrash metal bands. And if you're a fan of like Hellish, Mayhemic, or Critical Defiance, you should know this band. You should listen to this band because it's great. I'm looking forward to the possibility of a full length because it'll be great. Um, Hearse is a death doom metal band out of I'm assuming Pennsylvania or Virginia, however the reality of that is. Um, and this is a classic death doom metal band, very much in the style of early Paradise Lost and the first Cathedral demo and EP, and I guess you could go as far as album too. It's a classic, uh, extreme death metal take on traditional doom metal, and I think that's the most important core aspect of the music here is that it sounds legitimately early 90s. It has actual doom metal riffs, it has actual death metal in there, and they're combined in a way that makes a lot of sense and is a great listen, especially if you're a fan of actual 90s death doom metal and not the kind of revisionism that we've seen all year. Um, I think that this drags on a little bit. It's a little bit overlong. It's not a big deal if you just want to put it on, get your fill, and enjoy it. And there's members of Argus Lent, Crucifier, and Bludgeon in there too. And I think if you go back and listen to the earlier demos, they kind of had the same idea in the late '90s, and it's cool that they kind of delivered this really good album out of that. Um, it's unfortunate that access is somewhat limited because of other associations with other bands, but it's a great album that a lot of people will definitely overlook for those reasons. So, um, Ecstasis is a Swedish style death metal band from a couple of guys who are from the um, one is played in a lot of post-hardcore and '90s hardcore bands. The other one lives in Canada and is more of an engineer and played in some other bands I wasn't familiar with. And they came up with this Swedish style death metal demo with programmed drums, and they're not very good. Uh, I mean, the band is quite good. They've got an interesting melodic verve to it. I think it is not too traditionally Swedish. There is some hardcore influences in there that are actually kind of interesting in the way that they develop the riffs along with the melodies. I think that anytime there's a drum machine that is convincing, but obviously not real drumming, I, I'm just, I don't see the point of that in this day and age unless you are looking for a drummer. They found one after this had been recorded and released, or recorded at least, and it turns out to be Fred Espy of Dismember. So the big thing with Paralyzing Impermanence is that I'm looking forward to what they do next, if it's along this style, and there is some additional input from Espy, because he's quite a talent, of course. So this is sort of like a placeholder for like we're going to probably be great, but this is just a cool thing that I'm not going to fall out of my chair for it just because of what it could be if they had just bothered to record the live drums for it. If I'm wrong about the drums, correct me, but as far as I know, they're just programmed on there. Casket Grinder is a death metal band out of Medellin, Colombia, and so I think they're a quartet. Yeah, they've been around since I think at least 10 years, and they put out a bunch of demos, some minor releases, and they finally they took their time making sure they were like a quality, up to par death metal band who could play full on old school death metal in a not so usual way. And so this is their second record, and each of them have been entirely solid, kind of mid-paced death metal. I like that style, and they're not. It's not the usual, just like, hey, this is some bolt thrower kind of stuff or whatnot. But it does focus on a little bit of like kind of deicide monstrosity, but at a slower pace. There's a little bit of grindcore in some of their compositions. Like late '80s grindcore, and none of it's messy. It's all very buttoned up, very well played, and it's a really impressive band. I think that it just didn't knock my head off. It definitely sounds like a lot of these songs were written jammed with one guitarist and then kind of built up from there. And the songs feel like they were built for one guitar. Whereas a lot of their influences that shine through were definitely bands like Sinister and Deicide, where like the two guitar deal was really elemental to what made that over the top. So it doesn't feel as over the top. It feels a little bit more primitive, a little bit more brutal. And you know, in death metal, that's not a big deal. It's a good record. Um, but I see the potential here. Like I think they have several more albums in them, and I think they'll only get better with each one. You'll see the improvement between their 2020 album and this one. So I appreciated that record. Um, Morbid Stench is a death metal band from members of Insepulto and Conceived by Hate. I believe those are in El Salvador and Costa Rican bands. I could be mistaken though. That's what, as far much as I remember. This is a death doom metal band, and quite a good one, especially if you like the earlier Hooded Menace style death doom, closer to maybe like Rune Magic or those kind of groups where there's a more modern take on the doom metal side of death doom, and so this record it's a little bit familiar in a lot of ways because of the shared influences with a lot of popular bands right now. So it can be easy to kind of see it as like a Hooded Menace alike type band, but you could see that in a lot of groups, and it's not a big deal. The big thing about this is that these guys do blend actual death metal in with good riffs. You know, there's is doom in there, but the big thing is that this is an old school style death doom metal band, a little updated for now. So see if that sounds interesting to you. I think that there wasn't a lot for me to say about this because there are a lot of bands that sound like this, but picking it up and listening to it is still a pleasure. It's still like a good guitar album. It still has riffs, and it is well performed. So like there's value there. You just, you know, don't be a hipster about it and act like, you need to hear something new every time you pick up a record. Um, so yeah, I could talk about Skeptic for like an hour because I was such a big fan in the early 2000s and up till about the mid 2000s. Um, so I won't ramble on too much, but they basically they reformed and they turned the clock back to the sound on their first couple of albums, but now they have a little bit more of a less anxietous style of technical death metal that they play, which is rooted in the kind of what I call the post-symbolic era of progressive and technical death metal, where a lot of bands were influenced by the approach of late 90s death, but were doing their own thing with it and maybe making a little bit more brutal or a little bit more progressive. So that's sort of the bedrock laid here. So otherwise, this is kind of a classic band you'll remember from the early 2000s when one, Polish death metal was very big, brutal death metal was very big, and you saw a lot of technical death metal bands coming out of Poland, and it was hard for them to differentiate from the sort of Vader alike or the brutal side of things. And I think this band always did a great job of it. So you could still compare them to like Martyr and Anata if you remember those bands, and hopefully you do, because you'll like this record a lot if you do. Um, I think it's one of my favorite records on this list. It's been entirely underrated or just unnoticed, so definitely was worth putting on here. So Follow Seraphs is a French death metal band, and I think From Dust to Creation is their debut full length. There is another band from France with the same name. I think they're like a metalcore band. I'm not sure, but anyway, this one is you can hear the Covenant era Morbid Angel in it. You can hear some of the avant-garde ideas from earlier Immolation in their sound. And again, I would kind of, when I hear those two things at once, I hear it's kind of the root of what Anata was when they started and they're on their earlier albums and their first demo or two. So I immediately connected with this record from like with that thought in mind, and I found a lot of people just weren't responding to this record at all because it's a 30-minute knot of ideas that just doesn't It doesn't give you an easy in. It's just compacted. It's full on attack, but it's going to be hard to like pull those details out unless you're used to sitting down with a death metal record like this and parsing those details over the course of like 5 or 6 listens. It is a little bit demanding, and a lot of listeners are pretty lazy about that shit these days. So um, for me, it was a joy to listen to. I like there's this fine line between like late '90s, like more technical death metal, but still old school '90s metal, death metal, and the kind of brutality of the early 2000s. So this band kind of falls into that fine line, and it's in a sort of tradition of French death metal, not exactly. So it's a cool band, and I think more people should have noticed this record because it's very good. Um, so uh, Mantra. However you would say this band's name, I would say Mantra. Um, it's a trio from San Francisco, which has members. It's got Paul Ryan from Origin, which is obviously a big deal up front. He's playing bass and doing vocals on this record, and it's got a couple of folks you might know if you follow like more recent death grind and technical death metal. Cartilage um, is a like a death grind band, and Cyanic is a more modern sort of group. And the best comparison I can make for this record is like, oh man, so Mithras, if you is the best I can do. Probably like earlier Mithras, where the uh, the sound design was tuned in a certain raw way, where the guitar effects and electronics and atmosphere were all swimming together in a really over the top way, and it was very brutal. It sounded almost artificial, and this record has that feeling, that kind of over the top feeling, with a little bit less of the do it yourself sound to it. And the atmospheric kind of side of the band is the most interesting part of it. Um, I think they managed some kind of typical technical death metal grooves here, a little bit of '90s metal influence, which is just sort of bonking, technical, down-tuned. It's kind of the reality of like a lower tuned guitar kind of farting around for a bit, and all of that works for me. I think that the way they've tuned the drums here, it reminds me of that early 2000s to about 2005 side of brutal death metal and technical death metal. So there's a lot of things I like about this record. Um, and of course, the themes here are pretty cool too. And whether they're just vestigial interest or there's some actual spirituality behind it, I don't really know. But it's still a cool thing that we don't see too often, or often enough. Uh, so going towards like the more dissonant black and death metal side of things, Void Throne is a Seattle-based group, I think a quartet, and this is their third album. I reviewed their last one. I didn't give it a very high score, only because I think this is like the way that I see this band. It's semi technical, dissonant black death metal for people who really like um, frantic metalcore and chaotic metallic hardcore. Only because the movement and patternation of it really follows that. It's not like it sounds like Converge. It does sound more like a hissing than it does Converge, but you'll still appreciate it because there is that metallic hardcore edge to it, which doesn't read as in tune with like classic death metal and kind of my interest with like where dissonant death metal can go. So it's an interesting band to check out. Um, I think they've been able to uh, keep their over the top, very expressive, and um, kind of ruthlessly noisome and noxious approach. They stayed up front that this is a record of aggression. They're trying to strike you with something that evokes the deep and dark reality of everyday life, and I think they do that successfully enough. I don't, it wasn't entirely for me, but I still appreciate it. Grand Harvest is a Swedish blackened death doom metal band, and one that a lot of people have compared to 1914. Now, I don't listen to 1914. I don't know what that means. It sounds like poorly mixed uh, asphyx with a black metal vocalist, and this is much better sounding. It's a little bit more modern. It's a little bit more evocative. It's very well produced, and I think it's a little bit all over the place to start, but it reins it in eventually. So like there's a bit of the bolt thrower asphyx kind of barreling forward death metal side to the band. There's a little bit of like earlier Catatonia or you know the second or third Tiamat record in there too when they're lightening it up. And I felt like Necrovault was, if you follow Van Records or Von Records, was a similar type of band, but these guys, you can tell they've got some of their own Swedish touch and very professional everything going on. The nihilistic themes are very appealing. I think that it needs, this doesn't grab me. It's all very sepia tone. Not so, and I'm not like critiquing the cover. I mean, the whole experience is a little bit sepia tone. I don't necessarily feel the passion so much as I do the nihilism, and I appreciate that, but it doesn't necessarily say, listen to this hour of music. So um, I could see why it didn't grab a lot of people, or just a lot of people that you know, connect with didn't talk about this record at all. I think it's exceptional. It's just that it took a while to convince me that I should be listening to this and not just passing it right by. So whatever that is, that's how I reacted to it, and I would recommend it. Unyielding Love is what I didn't do a ton. Right, Irish band. I was gonna say like Vancouver. I didn't do a ton of research for this. I just know them as more of a frantic grindcore band, and now they've approached death grind a little bit more on this very long-awaited follow-up to their last material. Uh, the appeal of this record is similar to what you'd find in like a Full of Hell if they like death metal a little bit more and put it in their music more often. There is the noise is a part of what they do. Grind and power violence is sort of the baseline for what they do, and the same way that bands like Wake or Knoll have integrated some death metal into their sound. So of these guys, and it's worth checking out. It's really not that related to death metal, but it's something to add some variety to this list. Um, Teratoma, I believe they've been around in various forms since the early 90s, or at least the mid 90s. It's a Spanish death metal band based out of Barcelona, and uh, expect their sound to reflect early influences from not only early brutal death metal, but grindcore. And then tie that in with some bolt thrower. Obviously, the cover looks a bit like a Warhammer PC game from the late 90s. But Chaos Makers is, I think, the second record they've made since they sort of reformed with most of the original members, as far as I know. And they've gotten a grip. So if you're familiar with Grog in the sort of brutal, like savage, but almost artificial sounding, brutal death grind from Spain, and then you're familiar with Avulst in the late 90s, early 2000s. I mean, who wouldn't be at this point? These guys kind of fit in a way to those realities without forgetting to be mid-paced once in a while. They kind of start the record out thinking like, oh, this is going to be like a bolt thrower kind of mid-paced jogging death metal album, but they definitely hit the brutal notes here, and in a classic kind of late 90s, not very high budget kind of way, and I like that. It's for me, it's just nostalgic for like actual underground death metal, and not just stuff trying to sound like it. Um, And I could make similar notes about Rebel Souls. It is another Spanish band, but this one is more related to the Polish underground in the late 90s, where black and death metal was pretty big, and bands like Azarath and that were pretty influential beyond the typical sort of deicide influence stuff you'd find out of the early kind of post Vader 95 to 2000 sound. Um, and so you find some of that here on Dawn of Depravity. It's a pretty solid record. Like it sounds great. It isn't full on black metal at any point, but it does have that sort of that sound from that certain era. And um, if you were ever into technical brutal death metal and you were around at the height of like Crisian and uh, ever heard Hate before they got popular and changed their sound, that you'll feel right at home the moment this record hits, and it's a pretty good one. Um, and finally, uh, Heruvim are a Ukrainian band who it's a quartet. They're really cool, and they're just not quite there yet. Obviously, they just started out more recently, and their interest is seems to be mostly death thrash of a kind of unique variety. Uh, and that starts out with their interest in the world of Robert E. Howard and Conan, which is the theme for their most of their stuff. Shadowheart should tip you off, but maybe that's too obscure for most people. Um, but they're the how can I put this? The rhythms aren't uh, emulating the compact and tightly performed edge of traditional death thrash metal. They're kind of getting there at kind of a groovy, rocking pace, and it you can tell that they're capable, but they're only just arriving on their sound now. You know, so I thought it was a band that shows a lot of promise here, and I think that's the important thing about highlighting underrated bands is they might not be completely there, they might not ever fully get there, but there's you can this is something worth continuing on with, and I think that it needs to lose some of its half thrashing groove and just hit the either the thrash or the old school death metal standard, whichever they're going for, and just kind of push into it with more aggression. And that's kind of all that EP needed to stand up for me. So that's 15 death metal albums you might have missed in 2022. I'll have end of the year stuff coming up pretty soon, and there you go.